It began long before the black sands of Iwo Jima were stained with fire. Years before American flamethrower tanks roared across the volcanic rock, Japan's high command believed that their infantry, disciplined, fearless, and entrenched in fortified positions, could withstand any enemy assault. The Japanese soldiers who later faced these armored infernos had been trained to expect conventional American armor. They believed their bunkers, tunnels, and mountain fortresses were unbreakable. They had no idea that a weapon was coming, one unlike anything else deployed against them during the Pacific War. The story doesn't start in February 1945. It begins at the very start of the Pacific conflict, when Japanese forces were expanding across Asia, winning rapid victories and proving themselves among the most determined fighters the world had ever seen. American commanders quickly learned that Japanese defensive positions were unlike European fronts. These were men who refused surrender, who fought from caves and tunnels, who launched night attacks with bayonets even in hopeless situations. They saw death as honorable, and they believed their positions were sacred. Through 1942 and 1943, as the island-hopping campaign progressed, the Americans encountered a problem unlike any they had seen before. Every island, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, taught the same lesson. Japanese infantry could not be rooted out with traditional weapons alone. Grenades, rifles, artillery, naval bombardment. None of it guaranteed the destruction of hidden tunnel networks, where Japanese troops waited silently for the moment to strike. The caves absorbed explosions. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover entire beaches, and every bunker had overlapping arcs of fire designed to kill anything that moved. Commanders searched for answers. The flamethrower was effective, yes, but the handheld versions were slow, dangerous, and exposed the operator to enemy fire. Most of those brave Americans carrying the tanks never survived long enough to reach their target. The Marines needed something new, something armored, something that would let them clear bunkers without sacrificing dozens of men for every few meters gained. By early 1944, an idea began to take shape: modifying Sherman tanks, covering them with armor plating, and equipping them with powerful flamethrower systems capable of projecting a river of fire hundreds of feet. These tanks became known as flame tanks, and they were some of the most terrifying machines of the war. Their flamethrower nozzles replaced the traditional hull-mounted machine guns. Instead of bullets, they fired burning streams of napalm thickened to stick on impact, crawling across sand, rock, and steel. Nothing could extinguish it. When fired into a cave or tunnel, the fire consumed oxygen, turning defensive positions into death traps within seconds. But at this early stage, few Japanese soldiers had ever seen such a weapon. They had no idea what was coming, and when the Americans prepared for the invasion of Iwo Jima, they planned to bring as many flame tanks as they could. They knew that the island was one of the most fortified positions in world history. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers were waiting underground, commanded by the legendary General Tadamichi Kurebayashi. He had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress beneath the earth, with miles of tunnels, hidden artillery positions, blockhouses and bunkers connected through multiple layers of caves that could withstand hours of bombardment. The Americans bombed the island for 72 days straight before landing. Battleships fired continuously. Hundreds of aircraft dropped payload after payload. Yet the Japanese underground network remained almost untouched when the bombardment finally stopped and the American flagships pulled back. A chilling silence fell across the black sand beaches. Marines landing on the soft volcanic ash expected a weakened enemy. Instead, they encountered automatic fire bursting from invisible positions. From the moment the Marines stepped onto Iwo Jima, they were walking into a nightmare. The beaches offered no cover. The sand was too soft to dig foxholes. Every step forward was under fire. Machine gun nests were buried inside the hillsides. Mortars were hidden behind rocks. Snipers fired from tiny cracks in the basalt, and every inch of ground taken cost countless lives. Traditional infantry assaults were failing. Marines attempted to advance with explosives, with rifles, with bazookas, but the Japanese remained protected in their networks. Entire companies were pinned down by a single bunker that seemed impossible to destroy. At times, Marines threw explosives directly into the openings, only to watch Japanese soldiers reappear minutes later, unburned, unshaken, continuing the fight. And so the Americans unleashed a weapon the Japanese defenders had never expected: the flamethrower tanks. Their presence on the battlefield became known quickly. Some Marines even described seeing Japanese soldiers freeze upon spotting them. The tanks rolled up the soft volcanic ash slowly, their heavy treads grinding forward, every part of their armor blackened from previous engagements. Inside the tunnels, Japanese soldiers whispered warnings to each other. Some officers had heard rumors of these weapons on Saipan and Tinian, but none had truly believed them. None understood the destructive capability these tanks possessed. When the first flamethrower tank reached the edge of a bunker and fired its initial burst, the shock was immediate. A jet of thickened, flaming fuel erupted outward with a roar, extending over 100 yards in a stream of fire so intense that the very air around it shimmered. Japanese soldiers caught near the entrance didn't stand a chance. The flame crawled inside the openings, sucked oxygen out of the tunnels, and created temperatures high enough to melt metal. Even if the flame didn't reach them, the heat alone could suffocate anyone inside. It took only seconds to neutralize positions that previously required hours of brutal infantry fighting. And for the Japanese defenders, the psychological shock was even more devastating. Reports from survivors described pure disbelief. They had expected tanks firing shells, they had expected machine guns and mortars. But nothing had prepared them for a weapon that could fill an entire cave with fire. Some soldiers panicked and fled deeper into tunnels, only to be trapped when flames consumed the oxygen. Others tried to rush the tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies, but the flamethrowers kept them at bay, creating walls of fire they could not cross. The Marines quickly realized the immense value of these machines. They requested flame tanks for nearly every assault on fortified points. Engineers protected the tanks with extra steel plating, learning from each engagement, strengthening weak points, reinforcing fuel tanks, adjusting pressure systems. The flamethrowers themselves evolved, becoming more efficient, more powerful, capable of projecting longer and wider bursts of flame. As American forces pushed deeper into the island, they encountered the complex tunnel system connecting the north and south ends of Iwo Jima. Flame tanks became essential. They cleared tunnel entrances, destroyed pillboxes, and neutralized ammunition storage chambers. In many engagements, infantry refused to advance without the tanks supporting them. The Japanese defenders learned to fear these armored beasts more than any other American weapon. Flame tanks operated in teams. One would fire, while the others protected it from anti-tank ambushes. Infantry would advance behind the tanks, using their flame bursts as cover. The combination proved devastating. Japanese troops began abandoning surface positions entirely, retreating deeper underground whenever they saw the tanks approaching, but even underground, the fire could find them. The flame tanks made it possible for Marines to advance faster than anticipated. Positions that should have taken days to clear were destroyed in minutes. The intense heat collapsed tunnels. Oxygen depletion rendered hidden chambers unusable. And the fire struck fear into defenders who had previously been willing to fight to the last breath. General Kuribayashi, observing reports from the battlefield, realized the danger these tanks posed. He ordered special anti-tank squads to prioritize their destruction. But reaching these tanks on the open ground of Iwo Jima was nearly impossible. Snipers and machine guns protected the armored vehicles. Marines surrounded them, and the tanks themselves fired continuously, sweeping the battlefield with flames. As the battles raged across the island, word spread among the Japanese defenders about the horror of these tanks. Soldiers discussed them in hushed voices. Some believed the tanks were invincible. Others thought they were supernatural weapons, capable of burning through rock itself. Stories spread faster than facts. Fear became a weapon as dangerous as the fire itself. And so the island burned, slowly, painfully, inch by inch. As the Americans advanced, the flame tanks became symbols of overwhelming power, and for the Japanese defenders trapped beneath the volcanic rock, they represented an enemy that could not be stopped. By the time the Marines began capturing the northern sector of Iwo Jima, the Japanese troops who survived had witnessed the unimaginable. They saw entire cave systems destroyed. They watched their comrades fall not to bullets, but to fire that filled tunnels with suffocating smoke. They saw the unstoppable combination of American armor, engineering, and tactical innovation, and many realized, for the first time, that their fortifications were not unbreakable. Their underground empire, believed to be impenetrable, was collapsing. The fire was reaching everywhere, every crevice, every chamber, every corner where a soldier could hide. This was the moment when shock turned into fear, and the battle was far from over. The deeper the Americans pushed into Iwo Jima, the more apparent it became that this battle was unlike anything they had encountered before. The island was a maze of lava tunnels, twisting corridors, concealed firing points, and chambers carved with precision. The Japanese had prepared for months, some even living underground long enough to adapt to the darkness with remarkable efficiency. But as determined as they were, nothing could prepare them for the relentless advance of American flame tanks slowly crawling across the shattered landscape each day brought new horrors for the defenders. The Japanese had designed their tunnel system so that even if one entrance was destroyed, fighters could use secondary or tertiary exits to counterattack. But with the presence of flame tanks, these alternate routes became traps. Whenever Marines spotted an opening, they called in the tanks, and the tanks responded with a stream of thickened fire that rolled into the earth like a living demon. The tunnels, once silent and safe, filled with the sound of roaring flames echoing through the chambers. Japanese soldiers found that even if the flame didn't reach them physically, the heat alone could become unbearable. The air grew thin. Breathing became difficult. Flames consumed oxygen at an alarming rate. Troops hiding deeper underground began to suffocate without the enemy ever stepping inside. Officers attempted to maintain order, but fear spread faster than discipline. Men who had trained their entire lives to die honorably in battle suddenly faced a weapon that robbed them of every advantage they had built. Some defenders tried to fight back. They waited for the tanks to get close and then launched desperate counterattacks. Kamikaze-style charges were attempted, with soldiers sprinting from hidden holes with explosives tied to their bodies. But as they emerged into the blinding daylight, the tanks rotated their turrets or hull mounts and unleashed torrents of fire before the attackers could reach them. The black sands of Iwo Jima became a graveyard of burnt-out craters and shattered uniforms. Marines supporting the flame tanks grew aware of their importance. Infantry squads learned how to move with them, covering blind spots and eliminating threats before the tanks could be ambushed. Communication improved. Coordination became precise. Every terrain feature was analyzed. The Americans were learning from every engagement, while the Japanese were being forced deeper into positions where the tank's destructive power was maximized. Reports from Marines described how the tanks changed the emotional tone of battle. Before the flame tanks, approaching a bunker meant crawling through machine gun fire, hoping a grenade or satchel charge would be enough to silence it. After the tanks arrived, Marines watched as once indestructible fortifications went up in blazing fire within seconds. What had once caused terror now became manageable. The presence of fire was horrifying, but for the Marines who had been pinned down for days, it became a source of grim relief. They were no longer sending men into certain death, but for the Japanese, the psychological toll intensified. Every time a tank neared an entrance, whispers of fear ran through the tunnels. Some soldiers moved deeper into chambers, hoping to escape the flames. Others attempted to fight back with anti-tank mines or improvised explosives. Some simply accepted their fate, believing that if their bunker was targeted by flame tanks, they would die without honor. It was a weapon that did not discriminate between bravery and fear. It simply consumed. As the days passed, the American grip tightened around Mount Suribachi, the southern anchor of the Japanese defenses. The mountain, hollowed out with tunnels, resisted capture fiercely. But flame tanks proved uniquely effective. They swept around the base, burning out tunnel after tunnel. Marines advancing upward found resistance weakening. Japanese defenders, unable to retreat into the mountain's central chambers due to the heat and smoke, were forced to fight on the surface, where they were exposed. The iconic moment of the flag being raised atop Mount Suribachi came only after this brutal process of clearing out the lower defenses, much of which was achieved thanks to the flame tanks. But the battle was far from over. The northern sector of Iwo Jima was even more fortified than the south. Here, the Japanese had built layers of interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns were positioned to support each other. Anti-tank traps were dug strategically. Artillery pieces were hidden inside the cliffs, yet despite these defenses, the tanks pressed forward. Sometimes they moved mere feet at a time, inching their way through trenches and debris. Every engagement was painstaking. Every advance was paid for in blood. Japanese commanders in the northern sector observed with increasing dread how the tanks were systematically destroying their strong points. They ordered their troops to target the tanks' tracks or rear armor. They attempted to lure the tanks into kill zones. They used everything from explosives buried in the sand to suicide mines in an effort to halt the armored advance. But while some tanks were disabled, the majority survived. Engineers repaired damaged vehicles on the battlefield. Every tank that was lost was replaced. The Americans were relentless. Deep inside the tunnel networks, Japanese officers held emergency meetings. Their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The flame tanks had become the focal point of their fear. Some suggested abandoning positions rather than waiting for the tanks to arrive. But Kuribayashi refused to allow panic to take hold. He insisted his men hold their ground. But even he was forced to acknowledge privately that the tanks were one of the primary reasons the American advance had become unstoppable. The Americans, however, were not immune to the horrors of this battle. Flame tank crews faced unimaginable stress. Operating inside an armored vehicle under constant fire was terrifying. The tank's fuel supply made them targets. Japanese soldiers would aim specifically for the stored napalm. If a tank was hit in just the right spot, the results could be catastrophic. Some tanks exploded with tremendous force, killing the entire crew instantly. Others caught fire, leaving only seconds for the men inside to escape. Marines witnessed these losses with heavy hearts. They respected the tank crews deeply. Those men were essential to their survival. And when a tank went down, it often meant that infantry had to take its place, advancing into areas the tanks had failed to neutralize. But despite the losses, the flame tanks continued their deadly march. They cleared bunker lines, they destroyed command posts, they filled deep caves with fire, rendering them unusable. One by one, the strong points that Kuribayashi had trusted began to fall. Japanese soldiers ran from tunnels only to be cut down by machine guns. Others hid desperately, hoping the Americans might overlook them. But the tanks left nothing untouched. As the final days of the battle approached, the Japanese command structure collapsed. Units lost contact with each other. Ammunition ran low, food supplies dwindled. Some soldiers resorted to sharing crumbs of rice. Many had not seen sunlight in weeks, yet still, they refused to surrender. They waited quietly in dark tunnels, listening for the rumble of tanks outside. Every vibration through the ground made their hearts race. They knew what was coming. When the tanks unleashed their final attacks, the Japanese defenders experienced a scene that survivors later described as apocalyptic. The fire roared through tunnels that had once felt invulnerable. Walls glowed red-hot. The oxygen disappeared. Men fell unconscious before the flames ever reached them. Some attempted last-ditch charges, rushing into the open where Marines waited with rifles drawn. Others simply sat in silence, accepting that their time had come. Kuribayashi himself knew that the battle could not be won. He had predicted from the start that Japan would lose the island, but he had hoped to inflict such heavy casualties that the Americans would reconsider invading the Japanese mainland. Yet even his most dangerous and well-planned defensive structures had fallen to the Americans' devastating flame tanks and relentless infantry. When the final Japanese counterattack took place, a desperate night charge involving hundreds of soldiers, it was met by Marines armed with flamethrowers, machine guns, and artillery. The charge was annihilated. By the time the sun rose, the last organized Japanese resistance had ended. The black sands of Iwo Jima were quiet at last. Smoke drifted from the entrances of collapsed caves. Tanks sat motionless, their armor scorched from days of intense combat. Marines walked slowly across the battlefield, stepping over shattered weapons, burned-out tunnels, and the remnants of fortifications that had once been considered invincible. In the end, the Japanese troops who survived were left with a memory that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The memory of the American flamethrower tanks, the machines that had turned the earth itself into a weapon. For many, the shock of seeing their fortified world torn apart by fire was indescribable. They had believed that their tunnels, their bunkers, their determination would keep them safe. But the tanks had proved otherwise. The Battle of Iwo Jima became one of the most iconic and brutal conflicts of the Pacific War. The American victory came at enormous cost. But one thing was certain. Without the flamethrower tanks, the outcome would have required even greater sacrifice. These armored weapons shattered the myth of impenetrable defenses, breaking the back of the Japanese stronghold and altering the course of the war in the Pacific. And for those Japanese soldiers who witnessed these tanks in action, the memory remained etched in their minds forever. They had been shocked, overwhelmed, and ultimately defeated by a weapon that embodied the full industrial might of the United States. A weapon that turned the tide. A weapon that demonstrated that even the strongest fortress can fall when fire itself becomes a tool of war. This was the legacy of America's flamethrower tanks on Iwo Jima, a legacy written not just in fire, but in history.